Latinx, a person of Latin American origin or descent, used as a gender-neutral or non-binary alternative to Latino or Latina.
Latinx, we're black, we're brown, we're white. We're immigrants, we break binaries and cross borders. We speak all languages and are of all abilities, faiths, spiritualities, sizes, gender identities, sexual orientations, and documentation statuses, and we're here to stay.
I'm Alejandra.
I'm Ana.
This is Latinx Mental Health Podcast, where we talk to therapists, researchers, artists, activists, and students about their experiences in the intersections of mental health and Latinx identity. In each interview, we aim to connect through our voices, our struggles, and our triumphs, as we sample a different herbal tea, just like Abuela used to make.
For this episode, we spoke to Vanessa Flores, a licensed clinical social worker and founder of the Colors of Austin Counseling group practice. We drank chocolate con canela and talked about her experience of starting a business, balancing financial needs with her values, increasing access to therapy for people of color, and how we can avoid a scarcity mindset as women of color.
The Latinx Mental Health Podcast is not a substitute for professional mental health care. We encourage you to seek resources and support in your community. Hi.
Hi.
It's good to have you here.
It's good to be here.
So we're just going to jump in. Can you tell us a little bit about your background and how you came into social work?
Yeah. So I grew up in a single parent household. And so coming from that and having a father who was an alcoholic and abusive, I saw a lot, I experienced a lot. And I think that really influenced my desire to help people. But initially, my major in college was psychology. It actually wasn't social work. So I took what probably most people do is to take like an intro to psych class and then an intro to social work class, because I was told that would be like the best way to figure out what I wanted to do. And so between the both, it was interesting because my intro to social work professor was incredible. And I think he just really made me feel like that was the right thing. And so I did that route and kind of started and pursued social work. And so, but I would say my childhood is definitely what inspired that.
And where did you do your social work training? What universities or field placements?
Yeah. So I got my undergrad at Texas Christian University in Fort Worth. And then I went and got my master's at U of H in Houston. So I loved Houston. I think I don't regret it. I applied to UT and something just felt like I needed to go to Houston. And it was so diverse and it was such a big melting pot. And everyone in my program was of all ages, of all backgrounds, and had so many different experiences. I mean, there were people who were in there who had 2-3 careers before social work. And so it was pretty incredible. And I loved that. I loved that program and my cohort there.
That's awesome. That is different than UT.
Yeah. But you didn't go straight into counseling. You started off doing school social work, or can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So I had a couple internships in grad school and had an internship at a school and then had an internship working at a children's hospital. Well, it was a hospital in Houston that did both adults and children. And so I kind of experienced a gamut of different populations. I worked in adult trauma. I did children's ER. I did the burn unit. I did neonatal intensive care unit. I did pediatric ICU. So I kind of rotated between floors. That experience doing hospital social work really made me feel like, oh, this is what I want to do forever. And so I got a job working at the hospital that I interned at in grad school and really loved it. Life happened. I needed to leave Houston. I was there for about 3.5 years and worked in the pediatric ER. I did the adult trauma unit full time, which was really, really intense, but it was awesome. And then after that, I needed to leave Houston and kind of move on. And so I got a job at Dell Children's here in Austin, working in the pediatric ICU. And so then I worked there for about 3.5 years, got really burnt out. My health started to be affected by the experiences I had there because there was a lot of trauma, a lot of child abuse cases, a lot of deaths, a lot of grief and loss work. And while there was some grief around leaving a career in hospital social work that I thought truly that I was going to be there forever, there was a lot of grief around that. But ultimately, I think initially I wasn't able to make the connection that what was happening to me physically and medically was connected to my work.
Yeah.
And when I was able to get to that place and realize that was what was happening, I was like, I can't do this.
Yeah.
But then what do I do?
Yeah.
And so I went into school social work. My sister's a school counselor, so she does academic counseling. And I was like, she seems to have a really great time. Like, she really seems to enjoy it. So I did that, and I got a job at KIPP working as a social worker, and I was the second social worker that they've ever had. And so that was really cool because I got to kind of create the program from scratch and really just kind of go with it. And so I did that for another 3.5 years and then got my clinical license during that time and decided to move into private practice.
You know, you were talking about how you became a social worker because of a lot of the experiences you had as a child.
Yeah.
And it sounds like there's a lot of trauma there. And then working in trauma, I'd be curious to know about your own therapy and your own healing process. And because it just seems that, you know, you made these connections between your physical health and your mental health. And I'm guessing that came through some work. And I'd be curious to know about that if you're willing to talk about it.
Happy to talk about it. I'm very open about that kind of stuff. I feel like I had never been in therapy until I was an adult for a lot of reasons. It just wasn't something that was talked about or even brought to the forefront. I don't even think my parents knew what that was. And so I think as an adult trying to reconcile what's happening with me, I realized I needed help. But even when I was working at the hospital and was starting to have some medical issues, I still didn't even go to therapy at that time. It wasn't until I was in a new relationship that I realized I wanted to marry this person. We went to counseling before we got engaged. That was my first experience in therapy. Wasn't even when I was going through that transition in my career. So I definitely leaned on friends, talked with them about it a lot. And my sister at the time had lived in Houston, and she was a big support for me. But therapy didn't come into the picture until I started to realize, wow, I'm going to share my life with someone. I probably should work some of this stuff out and figure out if this is what I want.
Yeah.
And then after that, after we were done doing our work together, I stayed with the same therapist, and I'm still in therapy now. So I've been with my partner now for, 9 years. So I've been in therapy for about 9 years now.
Yeah.
Pretty consistently.
Yeah. That's something that I wish more social work and other mental health programs did, though, is, you know, normalize the need for us to go to therapy, people who go through those programs, because I think it kind of, sometimes it gets lip service. Like, it's like, oh, everyone should be in therapy, or just this kind of broad idea. But I don't know that, and I don't know what your program was like, but I don't know that there's always enough emphasis on what can happen to us when we're put in situations that are high trauma impact on our clients and we haven't done our own work. Because I think it's safe to assume a decent number of folks go into this work because of our own experiences. So I wish that we're more present and emphasized, and that space was made too in our programs, because with internships and classes, it's also sometimes hard to even know how to make time for other things like that.
Yeah. I mean, I went to a very white university for undergrad, and a lot of that had to do with my upbringing and living in South Texas, where everyone was Mexican or Hispanic descent, or wherever, you know, we were all pretty much the same.
Yeah.
And there was this big part of me that felt like I needed to go explore the world and see what else was out there and who else was out there. And I decided to go to school 9 hours away from home, which my mother was not very happy about. And she was angry about that. And she's not anymore, but she was. But I really struggled when I got there. I remember going into freshman orientation and being one of like maybe 5 people of color in the room, and everyone else was white. And not only were they white, they were very wealthy. And that experience really shook me to the point where I was on academic probation. I was, acting out in a lot of ways. And my mom threatened me and she said, I'm going to pick you up and bring you home if you don't get it together. And so that for me was like, okay, I really needed to get it together because I'm not going back home.
Boundaries.
Yeah.
Good job, Mom.
Yeah, really. And so, but at the time I'm thinking to myself, I could really use some therapy now.
Yeah.
And even then I didn't get that help.
So you had the thought.
Oh, yeah, I did. Many points in my life I had that thought, but there was so much fear around that.
Totally.
That what would I say to my mom if I told her that I was getting help from someone that was not
In the
her?
family.
Yeah, I get that. I think that fear of, what are you going to say about our private stuff? Or there's so many different things people think about therapy. I think that, and because it has been so privileged, like access to therapy has been so privileged for so long, that I think it makes sense, right? That there is not a lot of transparency around it. And I kind of wonder how this might actually lead us into talking about your current work in terms of access for a lot of people to therapy, and thinking about how we can bridge some of those distances and make things accessible and actually supportive for folks. So can you tell us a little bit about how you decided to open Colors of Austin Counseling, what it is?
Yeah, it's a loaded question.
Is it?
So I went into private practice, and I knew that was what I wanted to do, but I didn't know if I could do it, right? I think there was this inner voice that said, you don't have any business experience. What are you thinking? There's no space for you here. This Austin community of therapists is very white.
Yeah.
And are you going to be able to make this?
Yeah.
And I didn't have the financial resources to do that. And so luckily, I had a good community of people who said, do it anyway, right? And I think that I still kept my job at the school full time, and I started private practice part time. So I was working all day at the school and then seeing clients some evenings and weekends. And it was tough. I mean, I was working a lot.
Yeah.
But, I think that decision ultimately stemmed from me working in agency work for 10 years and me feeling like, okay, I'm ready. I'm ready to have some balance. I'm ready to live a life that doesn't feel like I'm pushing myself constantly, not just physically, but mentally and emotionally.
Yeah.
And I did solo private practice for 3 years before I started Colors of Austin Counseling in 2018. And the expansion that I had decided to do was really because I was getting a lot of referrals. And when I was looking at the referrals, I was turning a lot of people away, referring people out left and right. I was also on insurance panels, and so I was getting a lot of referrals. And not a lot of therapists take insurance in this city. I mean, there are several that do, but if you take it, then you're full all the time, pretty much. And so in really evaluating my referrals, I was like, who's coming to me, right? Who are these people that are finding me, that want to work with me? And I was noticing that it was a lot of people of color, especially women of color. And I thought to myself, okay, well, I'm tired of turning people away. Like this doesn't feel good. And so I did my research. I did some consultation with other colleagues who were kind of, expanding themselves, and decided to add a contractor and see how that went. and she filled up really fast. And then I added another one, and then they filled up. And I was subletting an office space at the time. And, the landlord was kind of like, you can't keep adding people, seeing people out of here. We're going to get in trouble. And I was like, you're right. It's time to expand. And so I went out on a limb and I got an office space with 5 offices and just slowly started to build this team.
Yeah.
And it happened really naturally. If you would have asked me when I started private practice if that's what I thought was going to happen, the answer is no. Mm-hmm. I thought it would just be me forever.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But it organically happened. And I think I look at my team now and I feel so proud of what we've built and the team that we have and the clients that we serve. And so it definitely feels worth it. It was just... it all happened so organically and naturally that I think that feels really good too.
Yeah. I think first off, thank you for sharing that, because I think a lot of people, when you were saying, I don't know if I could do this, I think I have a similar fear about a lot of things, like being a woman of color, and I don't have there's just a lot, I think a lot of doubt that you just have about yourself that you're told, because you're kind of programmed to have that doubt about yourself. And so it just stops you from doing things. Yeah. And to hear other women of color say I had the doubt too, and I did it anyway. I think that's so powerful and so helpful to hear. And I hope it's helpful for people who are listening to this, because I'm definitely feeling inspired by that.
And that you had a support system that encouraged you. I think it also speaks to the need to surround yourself with people that believe in you and encourage you, and that you can kind of take those worries to and be open about. Because I imagine that also makes a difference when the internal voice is like, do we want to do this? Can we do this?
Yeah.
And everyone's like, yes, go for it.
Yeah.
The follow-up question I have, and this is just coming out of I have no idea how this works, but insurance. Can we talk about insurance?
Yes. Yeah, we can.
Because you're right. A lot of providers in town don't take insurance.
Yes.
And can you tell us why that is and how you have made that work, if you don't mind? If it's not I don't know how complicated it is.
That's
but
a great question. It
Yeah.
sounds scary.
Yeah.
So that's fair.
Yeah. I could give, I've heard a lot of things about why people don't take insurance. And a lot of it is really simple, right? Logistically, insurance providers are hard to work with. There might be a chance that you don't get paid for services that you provide because insurance is, complicated, and they may not pay you, and you may not ever get paid. So there's this inconsistency of income. I think some people feel like they have a level of expertise and training that insurance can't compensate for, because insurance companies don't compensate at a very high rate. There are some that do, but most of them don't. And there's also a waiting period. You see someone, you send in the claim for that session, you may not get paid from 2 to 4 weeks for that session.
Yeah.
So the turnaround of that money, that it's not sustainable if that's what you're doing,
right.
Especially independently.
Right.
I think there's a whole lot of reasons. And, what I've seen here in Austin is that location matters of where your office is. So if your office is in an affluent area, then you probably could get away with doing purely self-pay, because your clients out there who are going to see you can afford that.
It. Yeah.
Our office is centrally located, and we have a second office in Cedar Park. And I think for me, one of my values has always been access. And I know, as a person of color, as a woman, as someone who didn't grow up with much, I knew that if I was going to therapy, which I am, I wouldn't be able to afford it without insurance. And so when I was finding a therapist, that was really important to me, that they take my insurance. And thankfully my therapist does, which is wonderful. And I'm so grateful for that. But, the access piece has been such a value of mine for a long time, and it still is, that I wanted to give people the opportunity to get services regardless of their income. And even at Colors of Austin, if we don't take your insurance, which for a lot of people we don't, we offer sliding scale services. We do pro bono. We do pretty low rates for people who qualify. And that's just because it's important to me that we're serving people regardless of where they're at.
Yeah.
Regardless of what stage of life they're in. And so, yeah, I think for me, it's just about what feels good and what connects with my values.
Yeah.
And in terms of like a business model, is it because of this group that you have that you're able to do the insurance? Does that help, or
Yeah.
I mean I don't want to like ask,
Yeah.
like I have a hard time asking questions about money is what I'm saying.
Hey, we're learning about
Yeah.
it.
Me. Well, I mean, it all goes hand in hand.
Yeah.
I mean, when I first started private practice, I got on 2 insurance panels, and a lot of that had to do with my money stuff, right? Like I have a lot of stuff, and when I say stuff, yucky stuff
Yeah.
around money.
Yeah. Totally.
I didn't grow up with anything, and for me to go into private practice, I did not have a financial backing of if this doesn't work or if you don't get paid for a couple of weeks, you have a stash over here. That did not exist.
Totally.
Yeah.
So hence why I kept my full-time job and started part-time. And so for me, insurance was almost like a security blanket. It was like, if I can get on insurance panels, surely people will come see me because they want to use their insurance.
That makes sense.
Right?
Yeah.
And so, and it's true, because like I said earlier, a lot of people don't take insurance. The fact that I did really helped my business take off.
Right.
And so my decision to be on it was, a lot of it had to do with my financial need of I need to make money while trying to start this business. And one sure way to do that is to get on insurance panels.
Okay. Yeah, you don't hear that.
Yeah. No, I think that's really helpful to think about. It's time to refill our cups. Join us at the table for a nice chat and a cup of tea in a part of the episode we call the sobremesa.
So Anna,
Yeah.
it is no secret that we are white.
Truth. I think that in several episodes now, we've been exploring the idea of what Latinx means, and there isn't one answer to that.
Yeah.
And it's real complicated.
It is real complicated because I've also referred to myself as a woman of color in this podcast. I'm also white, and I don't know. Can both be true? Am I wrong about one?
Right. I think that is an ongoing question.
Yeah.
An ongoing question. And today specifically, we wanted to talk about the idea of anti-Blackness within the Latinx community as a whole, and especially thinking about some of the things that we've been reading in the media about Gina Rodriguez and some of the stuff that she's said. We thought it would be a good entryway into this conversation.
Yeah.
Because it's a vital piece of the puzzle to think about the complexity of race within a term that actually speaks to an ethnicity or a heritage.
That many people here kind of confuse for a race.
Absolutely. I think especially in the U.S., people don't really know what to do with all these categories, which is fair, because there's always this kind of tension or kind of complexity of thinking about how socially constructed categories are socially constructed, and yet so much pain and oppression and violence happens as a result of the differences that these categories illustrate.
Yeah. And anti-Blackness is a reality.
Yeah. So just to briefly talk about what happened with Gina Rodriguez, there's been a couple things in the news. One of them was that, she was at that round table and just talked about Latina actors getting paid less than other people of color, Asian actors, Black actors. That was debunked pretty quickly.
Yeah.
And I think it just goes to show what we might talk about in a little bit, which is this idea of sort of infighting or a divide and conquer strategy of pitting people of color against each other, and that she kind of bought into that when she said it. And then she also then used the N-word when singing a song on social media. And she has apologized. She said she has a lot of work to do. But I know not everyone was really satisfied with her apology. And I think it really then goes back to us thinking about this idea of anti-Blackness. Where does it come from? How can we work to root it out in ourselves, right? And that regardless of your skin color as a Latinx person, if you don't identify as Afro-Latinx, then you probably have some internalized racism that you might want to work on. And that's something that is going to take time and effort and energy.
And honesty.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, I think that one thing that we've been thinking about a lot with this topic is the idea of racial democracy, or in Mexico, la raza cósmica. This idea in Latin America that there was more benevolence toward slaves or toward indigenous people. There was less violence, that everyone kind of got along. And that because of that, there doesn't exist the same level of racism as in the U.S., where there was slavery and institutionalized segregation and things like that.
And everybody just, made babies together. And then they created the mestizo, and that is Mexico.
And that is what everyone is. And there's a version of that, racial democracy, in Brazil. And there's versions of that in a lot of different countries. And what it really worked to do, and was a really intentional movement, actually, of the governments in these countries as part of nation building, was to erase non-whiteness. So it was to say, well, we're all a little bit of everything, but, we're just going to pick and choose the pieces we like of indigeneity and of Blackness. And in different countries, we'll kind of pick different pieces. But whiteness is still at the top of all of this. Like, it still is in the name of white supremacy. And it happened also and coincided with the eugenics movement, which was about like literally breeding people into whiteness, which we know genetically is like not a thing that can be done. But because of that background, I think, we have to take that all within the historical context that it came and know that it wasn't actually that long ago. We're talking about less than 100 years ago that all of these movements were happening. And we want to think about the impacts that it absolutely has to this day, and the continued erasure of indigeneity and of Blackness in all of the Americas.
Snaps. Yeah, true.
So when we think about Latinx communities specifically, we're oftentimes talking about geographically in the United States, right? And that's what we're specifically talking about. Exactly. Yeah. So I think what's really interesting then is, like we were saying, this idea of like race versus ethnicity in categories and like check boxes we have on the census, or when you take the SATs, or it's very socialized into us. And so bringing it back to what Gina Rodriguez said, really this idea of kind of comparing who's doing better and who's doing worse. I think one of the big kind of alarm bells for like anti-Blackness comes from assuming that you can separate Blackness and Latinxness, right? Because when you do that, you're really erasing all of the people from Latin America who consider themselves Latinx in the United States who are Black. And so, that kind of shows the idea of, if you're Latinx, you can't be Black.
Yeah. Or if you're Latinx, you're one thing.
Exactly. Right. It's this homogenizing of it. And I think that the piece around divide and conquer really comes up here.
Yeah. I mean, it's just such an unnecessary thing to say, right? I mean, the conversation is really around representation, right? And this is the conversation that we're having right now, too. And so there really was no need for her to go and say that, well, Asian women get this much representation, Black women get this much. It's that white women, white culture dominates the media, and therefore there isn't enough room or isn't enough perceived room for people of color's voices and experiences. And that's really the point.
Right.
Yeah. So, and this goes back to what you're talking to. This is like specifically anti-Black.
Yes.
And, and I hate to say it, right? Because I come from a big Latino family, but and I think I think a lot of us are going to be able to relate to this, is that we're all a little bit racist.
Yeah.
Like, we can say that we're like one big happy family, but it's just not true. You got to check in with grandma.
Yeah.
You love your abuelita, but I'm sure your abuelita has said some things about Black people.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Just like, white, like we talk about, older white folk.
Mm-hmm.
It's the same. We need to be having these conversations too. This isn't just for, quote, white people or what we perceive as white people in this country.
Right.
Like, we need to be having these conversations about racism and about anti-Blackness, because it's just as prevalent in our community.
And it's just as common in a lot of Latin American countries as it is in the US to not actually learn about the real history of oppression and of erasure of different peoples and different cultures over time. When I TA'd a course at UT with a professor from Brazil who was teaching a class on race and democracy and thinking about what that looks like in different countries, there were about 5 students in the class that had grown up in Mexico. And when we did several lectures on the history of racism, of what La Raza Cósmica and the creation of it looked like, and on the erasure of different people, they came up after class and they said, we never learned about this in schools. And I can say definitely the same for learning about truly about slavery and truly about segregation and truly about different types of racism, about racism against Chinese folks and other immigrants in the US. We don't learn about it. And when we can't reckon with our history, and this is something that I think actually Trevor Noah speaks to really well, based on his experiences in South Africa. But when we don't reckon with our history in that context, I think it makes it a lot harder for us to give full value to the need to analyze how we have been socialized and then change how we then act in the world, because it comes to this like, well, I'm not racist. Like, it's bad to be racist. So I don't want to be racist. And it's like, it's part of a broader system, right? It's not just you that's the problem. It's this broader system, and it's this broader understanding we need to come to.
Yeah, and we've spoken about this on the podcast too, about not looking at racism as an individual problem, but as an institutional problem, with real personal, interpersonal ramifications and realities, right? Yeah. So it's not that it's just this larger system, right? But it comes into our reality in this very real way, and it comes into our families in a very real way. Yeah. And if we're not being honest with ourselves, then there's really not a whole lot that we can do to change it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Do you want to talk a little bit about how it came into your family?
Yeah. So I was just telling Anna, I'm going to, I guess, out my family a little bit here. But, what I'm about to share is something that I've seen pretty much every Mexican family that I've interacted with. And I'm sure that people listening are going to identify with it in some way, because of the nature of genetics and because of marriage. People just come out looking different. Yeah. And so in a large Mexican family, you will have folks who come out fair-skinned and folks who come out darker. And in my family, my grandmother has 4 siblings, 3 of which came out fairly light-skinned, my grandmother being very light-skinned, red hair, green eyes, and her youngest sister looks indigenous. She's dark. And my entire life, this aunt who, looks indigenous, she's dark. And for my entire life, we've called her Tia Negra, which means Tia, like black aunt, La Negra, the black one. She's in no way black. She would never be mistaken for a black woman. She's just darker than everybody else. And her experiences, when you compare her experiences as an immigrant to my grandmother's experience as an immigrant, they're very different because of the way she was perceived. And these are sisters from the same, not half sisters, same parents, wildly different sort of experiences. My grandmother was always sort of applauded for her beauty. And I mean, I don't think my aunt was ever told she was ugly, but my grandmother was always the beautiful one. Right. Because of her skin color.
And that's some of that implicit language that happens, right? When you're not told you're beautiful, that can carry the same message as you are ugly.
Yeah. And then in any sort of like Mexican family, or when somebody has a baby, like there is always this like sort of and not just in my family, like I'm just talking about like interactions I've had.
Yeah.
There's always like concern about like, well, how dark is the baby going to
Yes.
come out? Like,
Yes.
oh, you're beautiful if you're light skinned. Oh, I hope he gets so and so's genes,
Right.
rather than this darker person's, because you're perceived as better, and and in a lot of ways you have more opportunities if you present as white.
Mm-hmm.
There's reality in that because of the reality we've constructed, obviously.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I've heard that in my family too. And I think that, you know, that piece around language and how we use language and how quickly someone gets called tia negra or, you know, we're even thinking about the loteria cards and, you know, there's the little black boy, right?
Yeah.
On the card. And so the ways that this just has this long, long legacy, right? That when you say that, you're not necessarily consciously calling up that long history and legacy, but there is a weight of that behind those words.
Yeah.
And if we don't do the work to investigate that and understand that and uproot that and really think about the way that we use language and think about, you know, who we're including in what categories and why and who's being asked in the first place about that, you know, then we're just reinforcing the legacy of racism, and we're just reinforcing some of the myths around how far we've come.
I think to sort of like close the conversation, it's, you know, this isn't to make anybody feel bad. I'm so surprised by how little we think about this, and how little I have had to think about this in my life, and how little sort of weight there is within our own community to think about it. Because I think we get a free pass because we're perceived as people of color, right? Just because you're perceived as a person of color does not mean that you don't have to do this work.
And I think that, you know, what you just said about like not having to think about it, that's like the literal definition of privilege.
Exactly.
And so I think that, you know, because of that, that's where the reckoning has to come in. So it means that there is a holding of privilege, right?
Yeah.
And so we can't just say Latinx and be picturing one person.
Yeah.
And we can't just say Latinx and be thinking about a homogenized group of people. And we can't just say Latinx and forget about all of the people who are in this country, who are Black, who are from Latin American countries, or whose family is from Latin American countries, and who experience this multiplicity of oppression as a result of their heritage, their skin color, their accent, whatever number of things, that we need to be really exploring what this looks like. And we need to be thinking about the implications of that for ourselves and for our community, for our mental health work, and for healing overall as a whole.
Yes, and to not assume, I think if I were to say anything to sort of to white practitioners or to white therapists, when you are thinking of doing referrals, to not assume that Latinx means like that you can just refer somebody to somebody who is Latinx, and that's enough of a connection, or that it's the same thing, because it isn't, right? And then that's when you think about anti-Blackness and oppression against the indigenous populations as well, because I think that kind of goes hand in hand and is similar.
Absolutely.
That a middle-class white Mexican person is not the same thing as a farm worker from Oaxaca.
Right.
That, you know, there may be a shared language, there may not be a shared language. That's another thing. But to just have that in mind, because I think it's very easy to sort of paint everybody with like one brush stroke.
Right. And that's true also for therapists of color, right? To be checking our biases, to be checking, you know, what we were told growing up about different people, and to be open to learning about the individual in front of you, sharing with them, holding space, and learning from them and their experiences. Now back to the interview. You just mentioned doing things that align with your values. And I think that it's really common to think that holding values and making money like are in conflict, or can be in conflict, or, you know, that you can't hold on to social justice values and also be profitable. I think that's kind of a conception that people have. And so I'm wondering if you can speak to that, given that you are working in the expansion of social justice and access and things like that.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think for me, being really clear about my boundaries as a business owner and my values as a human, I have to find ways for them to coexist. And I think being a business owner where you clearly have to make a certain amount of money to cover overhead costs, which can get really big when you're a group practice. When we're talking about rent and supplies and utilities, it's a lot of money, liability insurance. And so obviously, smart business owner would say, you need to make sure you're making money to pay those things, right? And my human self says, what are creative ways that I can still serve the community that align with my values of access? So hence bringing on a practicum student that is able to see pro bono clients at pro bono rates or very, very low rates, like under $30. Having provisionally licensed therapists on the team who aren't allowed to be on insurance panels because they're not fully licensed.
Right.
Therefore, they can offer sliding scale rates. I mean, all our therapists offer sliding scale rates regardless of, whether they're fully licensed or not. But that is another way to meet that need, providing free workshops in the community, providing groups at a really low rate.
Yeah.
Doing presentations at schools, going out and tabling events and, letting people know of our services. I feel like all of those are really creative ways that we've tried to figure out how to meet those needs. And ultimately it's worked. I mean, I'm a big believer that what you give out, you get back. And I think that, being able to give back to the community in different ways has brought an energy through the clients that come to us. We have an abundance of business. And I think that it's important when you're in private practice to not come from a scarcity mentality, which I think a lot of people do. And for me, I'm constantly, reminding myself, because I can get into that place too of not enough, not enough clients, not enough money, not enough resources, not enough therapists to meet this need. And I have to remind myself that there's enough. There's enough for all of us, and there are enough clients out there, especially in the time we are in now in our world, that are desperate for support. And desperate to be in a safe space with someone that looks like them.
Oh, I just got goosebumps.
Yeah, absolutely. I really appreciate that because that has been a theme we've talked about before of the scarcity mentality. And even like the first day of social work school, I'll never forget at orientation, how many times the joke of like, you're all here to make big bucks, right? Or something like that was said. It's I know. And I didn't really truly fully reflect on that until later in the process where I looked back and I said, oh my goodness, like the fact that we're joking about this on day one, like what mindset does that put us in? And how does that stop us from advocating for ourselves and for our profession and for the services and for us to get away from that scarcity model? So I really appreciate, you not just talking about the need to change that, because we can talk about that all day long, but giving us an example of how to live that. That's different.
And I'm guessing that this is a viable business model and it's working for you.
It is working. And, I am not out there buying buildings and real estate.
Right.
But I have a good life, and the most important thing is that we're doing good work. And we're doing work that is really rare. There are not many practices in Central Texas and in Austin that offer services by therapists of color.
Right.
And it's a huge need. And I think that I feel really proud that we have a team that looks like the clients that we serve.
So you're majority therapists of color.
Majority of them, I would say about half of us. We're a team of 12. And so about half of us are therapists of color and half are white. But, but even with that, right, there are people who come and we make sure they are in line with our values of the practice. And so even with that, I feel good about that.
Social justice oriented. What are some things that you wish you had known before starting a business?
Yeah, it's a great question. Things I wish I would have known. I wish I would have known that patience is key.
Ooh, yeah.
Yeah, that this wasn't going to be I have an office space. I'm making money. Let's go, right? I wish that I would have known that I needed to find my people first, my community, my tribe, my people that were going to support me, because I didn't have a community of therapists in private practice in the business world that I could just access easily. I had a couple, probably about 2,
Right.
who significantly helped me at the beginning and who are my dear friends now, but I didn't have a community. And so
Yeah.
I was doing all of this by myself. I also wish that I would have known that it's okay to ask for help.
Yeah.
I'm not good at asking for help at all. And again, that comes from my childhood. Everything was you do it on your own and you need to do it well and you need to do it yourself because no one's going to do it for you.
Yeah.
That was what I was taught. And that served me well for a long time.
Sure.
But when I went into business, it was like, this is really isolating.
Yeah.
This is really scary. And the truth is, I don't know if what I'm doing is right. I'm just doing it based on the books that I've read, the workshops I've gone to, the podcasts I've listened to. That's what I'm doing. And so I wish that someone would have said, it's okay to ask for help. It's okay to find people who will give you the answers instead of searching for them for so long.
Yeah. Well, and like you're talking about like that kind of that scarcity mentality and that competitive mentality, right?
Yeah.
Like, I mean, there really are enough clients in Austin to go around.
Oh
Like,
my gosh, yeah.
Even like most, I don't know, I feel like when I look at most therapists, like most are booked.
Yeah, waitlisted.
Yeah.
And
Oh my gosh. Yeah.
definitely, especially sliding scale agencies that
Yeah.
serve folks that, maybe don't even have insurance, but not because they're super wealthy,
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
On the other end of the spectrum. So I think
Yeah, it makes so much sense to work collaboratively.
definitely. And like you said, I think like when we talk about diversifying income within nonprofits or within other spaces, it sounds like you also found your way toward that. And what I think is kind of beautiful about it is through thinking about living your values, which was to increase access along this broad spectrum, you also created a diversified income source because you have the insurance and the sliding scale and all the different pieces moving, which also is like financially savvy.
Yeah.
So that's such a beautiful way to think about how you actually can increase your stability business-wise and financially through values and through living those values. I think that's really beautiful.
Yeah.
So you mentioned that you lead workshops in the community. And I know you also have some professional development type retreats. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about what those look like.
Yeah, this is the stuff that gets me revved up too. I love it. So like I had no business background, right? And I think once I started a business, now we're 2020 will be 2-year anniversary of Colors of Austin.
Yay.
And 3 years private. And so 5 years into it now, I feel like I was just talking about this with someone else the other day, but the business part of this really gives me a lot of energy.
Really? Wow.
And I had no idea
Yeah.
that would happen. But I really, really love the business aspect of this, that you can grow something from scratch based on some values and your beliefs of what you want it to look like. And it can just go and it
Yeah.
can be successful. And you can find people who believe in it too. And so I'm really passionate about getting other people to get to that same place, right? And so some of the things that I do outside of seeing clients in my practice is I do business consultation. So I created a brand called Brave and Well, which is a community of, healers and business owners that come together from time to time to learn about ways to have a healthy business and become an entrepreneur, but also to take care of yourself as a healer and an entrepreneur. So we host different events. It's a fairly new brand. And so I'm trying to collaborate with other therapists in the community and figure out what do other people in my position or people who aspire to be in this position, what do they need? What are they looking for? So Brave and Well is kind of that little community that I'm trying to build and mold. I lead a business consultation group called the Private Practice Circle. We meet every 2 weeks, Thursday morning, and it's a group of therapists who are either about to start a business, are in private practice, or expanding their practice. And we just talk about the business side of things and support each other in that.
And is that something that's open to people or?
Anyone can join. There is a small fee associated with it, but that's another thing is that all these offerings, I try to make them really low cost because I know when I was first starting out, I couldn't afford to take $1,000 business workshop just to figure out how I was going to do this.
Totally.
So remembering where I was and where I come from and remembering that access is important again. So I lead that. I am also a clinical supervisor. So I provide clinical supervision to other social workers who are looking to become fully licensed. And I'm also a co-founder of Austin Therapists of Color, which is a community of therapists of color here in Austin. And that's a really new thing in the past couple of years that we built. I think we have over 300 people in our
That's awesome.
community, and we host events to just support each other. And that's also open to whoever wants to come and join and just talk about what it's like to be a therapist of color in Austin and how do we move through this space together without feeling like we're alone.
Yeah.
And you can send us all of that information so we can share it with listeners.
Definitely.
And maybe go ourselves.
Yeah, for sure. Like, I want to go.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's really lovely because the idea of kind of connecting folks and feeling that you're not isolated, especially what you said earlier about Austin being a white space in a lot of different ways, not just for therapists. But I think the other thing that can lead to is feeling like that scarcity model around therapists of color. And to hear you say the number 300, even I noticed that I was surprised, and then I thought I should not be surprised by that.
Yeah.
Right. But I think that's the other thing that it can kind of get drowned out. And even at our School of Social Work, right? Like when we think about bringing bilingual students together and that's not something that's prioritized. And so the fact that you can get folks to like network with one another and then be more present and visible, I think that is super important and impactful, because I think that's also how we help make sure that mindset of who is here also shifts, right? So that we increase that visibility.
Yeah, and it's open to people who do agency work too, to students, to people in private practice. And it's incredible the response that we get of people who are in agency settings who are saying, hey, I'm the only therapist of color at my agency and I'm having a really hard time.
Yes.
And just being able to share that with people who get it. I think that has been so healing and really moving for me, because I got to do agency work in spaces where there was a lot of people that look like me. And so I don't know what that feels like, but I do know what being a person of color feels like, right? And so I just love being in those spaces. It feels like home, right?
Yeah. That's actually part of why we started this podcast. Yeah. It was
Yeah.
for those people that you just mentioned.
Yeah.
And for ourselves.
And for ourselves, because we've been those people.
Yeah. Like I know that when I thought about doing something like this, like a part of it was my own thirst for these stories and for reaching out and for like talking to people like you, because they're out there. You're out there.
Yeah.
Hello. And so this is just kind of like a ruse to like get you all in a room and talk to you.
Right.
And like make sure everyone else gets vicariously then to kind of feel not alone, feel heard, feel understood.
Yeah.
And get to connect that way.
Yeah. Right.
So it's really like, it's work you're doing as a service, but it's also giving back to you. And that kind of leads to the next question. And you've touched on this a little bit throughout, but if you would just a little bit more specifically talk about the ways in which you take care of yourself doing this work.
Yeah. Our last Brave and Well event was about self-care. And I struggle with this question a lot because I will be honest and say I don't have it figured out for myself.
Yeah, it's hard.
Do any of us?
It's really difficult. Yeah. I feel really, really lucky to have a strong group of therapists that are my friends. They're my colleagues, but they're also my dear friends. And they're also my cheerleaders in a lot of ways. And having them, being on group chats with them, meeting up for coffee, just being in their presence, I think really empowers me to keep doing this work. My partner's a great source of strength for me. I think he believes in me more than I believe in myself sometimes. So I feel really grateful to have him. But I have to be really intentional about scheduling my time with people. And that's how I'm intentional about taking care of myself. Because like I said before, like this work energizes me. Being a business owner energizes me. Figuring out ways that we can expand and do more and serve more energizes me. And so I could do that all day. It's stopping is what's really hard.
Yeah.
So
I'm looking at Anna.
We just did a whole episode about rest.
Yes. And so if I have a dinner at 6:00 on a Wednesday, then I'm not going to schedule a client at that time, right? I'm going to go to that dinner. Or if I plan a weekend to go see my family, then that's what's happening. And so that really works well for me. Yes, it's like boring and scheduled and, annoying. It's not spontaneous.
Yeah.
But it works for me. Yeah. And that is what I have to do. I do value my schedule a whole lot and creating boundaries around my schedule. So that for me has worked. I think outside of that, I don't have a lot of practices, but, within those slots that I've created to say, hey, this is my time to connect with people. This is time to connect with my partner. This is time to connect with my family. That fills me up so that I can come back and continue this work.
Yeah.
So it's enough.
Well, it's about knowing yourself and what you need, right? Because it sounds like connecting with others is part of how you're filled up. Whereas I know other people who need alone time to get filled up, So I think it's also, you're being intentional about what you need for yourself and that involves more than yourself, right? Yeah. It involves community and it involves the different ways that make you feel like you're able to do the work that you want to do.
And therapy, right? I schedule it every 2 weeks. And it's funny because I don't put so at Colors of Austin, we work off of a system, an electronic health record system where we all have access to Simple Practice and we schedule our clients there and everyone can see everyone's calendar. And I don't put personal things on that calendar, but I do put my therapy sessions on there because I'm hoping that my team sees it.
Yes.
And they're like, okay, picking up on the fact that I'm making time to take care of myself and you should too.
Awesome.
Yeah.
I love that.
Yep.
I love being in spaces where people are open about going to therapy and talking about it.
Yeah.
And that's been one of my favorite parts of being in this field.
Yeah.
That's awesome. Well, is there anything that we didn't ask you about that you would like to talk about or that comes to mind during this conversation?
Yeah. I think one last thing I will say is to anyone who's thinking about taking on this venture of opening a practice or joining a group practice, I would say that there's space for you. There's room for you. And yes, it's really scary, but it's 100% possible. And with nothing, with no experience, with no money, it is possible. And there are people who will help you if you ask questions. And I think with that, yes, there's space for you, and take your time with it.
Yeah.
I have met, I think this city is like we've talked about, saturated with therapists. And what I've realized is there are a lot of students coming out of school who are in a rush to get to private practice.
Yes.
They are like ready, and
Yes.
that's what they want. They want flexibility, they want money, they want freedom. And what I would say is take your time, because being in agency work for 10 years has really given me the grit and the tenacity to be able to run a business.
Yeah.
And it's given me a patience that I didn't have before, to say, this life is what I've desired for so long. It's what I've worked hard for so long. And I don't want to lose it. I don't want to lose this balance I have, this ability to not to be, you know, free from medication and having health issues from where I was before. Like, I don't want to lose that. And so this feels really sacred to me to be able to keep working for it. And I think that had I not experienced agency work, I probably wouldn't have the same appreciation for it now that I do. And so I would say to just take it slow.
Yeah.
Like, there's time for you. There's going to be a time, and there's going to be a space for you.
Yeah.
And there's going to be plenty of people who are willing to help when you're ready.
I think it goes back to the theme we've discussed, right? Like, the scarcity mentality can really trap us.
Yeah.
And as, like, I almost hate to say it because it's like a little bit cheesy, but like living abundantly. And that as people of color, like, you get to live abundantly too.
Yes.
And that there's a community here. That's a really beautiful message.
Yeah. Really powerful. And I would venture to say radical message. Yeah. Oh. My goodness. All right.
Last question. My favorite question. I get to ask it.
Yay.
What is your favorite herb or tea?
Great question.
I know.
I will be honest and say I don't drink tea. However, my favorite thing to drink that reminds me of home and my mom and being in her care is Abuelita's hot chocolate. That's my thing. And she's coming to visit me for Thanksgiving.
Aww.
And so she's going to make me tortillas and fideo and
all the comfort foods.
Abuelita's hot chocolate. I said, please bring all your things.
The whole kitchen.
Yes.
That's awesome. Well, I'm glad we happen to have hot chocolate today.
I know.
They did good with that.
Witchy.
Yes. Bruja. And it's been so lovely having you here with us. Thank you so much.
Thank you. This has been wonderful.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Latinx Mental Health Podcast. You can follow us on Twitter and Instagram at LatinxMHPod, find us on Facebook and YouTube, and subscribe everywhere you listen to podcasts.
Hasta la próxima!